Okay, everyone. So here in this is going to be the first of two videos for this week, week 6. And here we're kind of moving away from looking at the firm. Now, last week, like some of the stuff we went over with exchange rates and international trade, that's considered like, macroeconomics, but we're still looking at it from the viewpoint of a firm. Now we're going to kind of just, scale out and just talk about things, not necessarily think about like things just from a firm's perspective, but talk about some, different macroeconomic variables that are really important that we try to keep track of. And the government, they really keep track of these in case they need to intervene to try to improve things. There we go. All right, so just kind of a recap. Like we said, we talk about economics. It's this, social science that studies, these choices of individuals and firms, and so, how they deal with like the fact that they are under constraints, that there's a limited amount of resources, and how they make choices under these constraints. Macro is where you study, like individual people and firms, households are responsible for this, but you're looking at how these individual decisions aggregate up and cause movements in these big variables that we keep track of for countries. Right? So with macro, you're looking at the country as a whole, the country's unemployment rate, the country's GDP growth, the country's inflation rate, things like that. Whereas micro, like you said, we're just looking from decisions from individuals or firms, the decisions they make and how they interact with one another. Okay, just a quick little refresher: the law of demand, law of supply. Law of demand is, all else being equal, that is, everything else remains the same. As the price decreases, the quantity demand of that good will actually increase. Okay, so there's an inverse relationship between the price level and quantity demand. Now that makes sense. If something gets cheaper, everything else remains the same. Well, you can buy more of it, and so you will for most of the part. So you'll have a higher demand for it. Law of supply. This relationship will actually be a positive, direct relationship. All else being equal, the only thing that's changed is the price here. If you see an increase in the price of a good, that will cause an increase in quantity supplied. That's because these firms can sell this good for a higher price now. And as a result of that, that'll increase their profit, and they're more likely to increase the supply as a result of that. Okay. One thing to keep in mind here, the all else being equal, the ceteris paribus condition, really important. Right. So, you could see the price of a good going down, and well, then the quantity demand could be going down as well. But something else could be going on here to describe this. All right. Something else has changed demand, maybe have a decrease in buyers. All right. Maybe there's the price of another good is decreased more that you can substitute for it. So you substitute away to that. So the important thing is you got to always remember when you're looking at this, this all else being equal is really important. All right. So this is a market for a good here. You get your price on your y-axis, the quantity on the x-axis, supply curve. As you can see, as the price gets higher, the firm will supply more, the quantity supplied increases. But if the price decreases, well, then the quantity demanded will increase. Okay. Now, if the price is such that it brings these in equilibrium, that is, the market clears, this is what's known as the equilibrium price. All right, but two things can happen here. You can have a price that's too high or low. If the price is too high, well, then firms are going to supply more of the good than demanded, because, well, the price is high, it's good for them. The firms, they can earn more profit. But since the price is higher, well, these households aren't buying as much now. These buyers aren't buying as much. And as a result of that, you're going to see a surplus, which means these firms, like if it's a grocery store or whatever, they're going to have their goods sit on the shelf for really long. They may be about to expire. They're taking longer to sell than they normally do. So what they'll see, they'll recognize this and okay, well, we need to lower the price. And so that'll move the price towards this equilibrium value. And the same kind of principle holds true if the price is too low. Right? So if the price is really low, well, there's going to be a lot of demand for it because it's cheaper now. But the firms aren't willing to produce as much of it. The supply is going to be really low. So there's going to be actually a shortage of goods here. So firms see this, like stuff's flying off the shelf, like, oh, okay, let's raise our price. And they'll raise the price and that'll bring things into equilibrium here. So you always got these forces in a functioning market that are going to move the price towards the equilibrium level. It may not always be at it, but there's forces in place that kind of move it towards it. One more principle to kind of really to go over in that, that's the principle of opportunity costs. That is, whenever you make a decision to do something, there's always some sort of opportunity cost. If you make a decision to go to the movies, well, the opportunity cost is, going hiking in the national forest or something. If a business decides to produce one good, the opportunity cost is like, well, what can they do? They're missing out on earning revenue from producing some other good. So you always have to, weigh these opportunity costs when you're making decisions here. And that's what people do. They'll make these decisions and they'll look at the opportunity costs and that'll, guide them toward what's the best thing to do. So that one example of this, that's pretty good with the opportunity cost. So a lot of people stayed out, maybe they stayed out from the labor force a little longer than they would have in the pandemic. That's because you had this supplemental unemployment insurance that the federal government stepped in and provided. Now they did this because they knew there's just a large chunk of the economy. There was no jobs to go back to. Like the service sector really got hit hard, and a lot of restaurants were just closed for that summer. And so to make sure they kept spending money and then, people didn't fall too far behind, they supplemented their unemployment insurance with federal unemployment insurance. And because of that, some people were getting paid more money than what they had for job, right? And so as a result of that, the opportunity cost was a lot lower for not working. And since it lowered the opportunity cost for not working, well, people didn't get in quite as big of a hurry to find another job. So that was kind of the drawback of doing that. The benefit was obviously, people were able to keep spending money like they normally would. And you just would have had a large chunk of people just getting behind on their bills and not spending money. And it could have impacted the other areas of the economy. They really wanted to prevent this. All right. Okay, so now on this video, we'll cover chapter 19. This is just kind of an overview, the macroeconomic perspective. We'll kind of go over some of the variables that economists look at and one of the ones that are important. Just kind of touch on those briefly. Okay. So kind of the things we'll do here. We'll look at these different components of a nation's economic output and talk about their, examine the relative contribution from each. Also look at the different ways to measure economic output and make some international comparisons. And one of the things you have to do with this, you have to because you're looking at different, like the exchange. We'll look at the exchange rate. I'm sorry. We'll look at output for say Brazil versus the U.S. Well, U.S. is in terms of dollars, Brazil's in real. Well, how do you kind of get a measurement to compare them? Well, you need to correct for the exchange rate. Okay, that's one way to do it. Another way is to do it with looking at what's known as purchasing power parity. Look at a basket of goods and compare them from each country. All right, so here we're looking at macroeconomic goals for a country. This is stuff that policymakers, people at the central bank, these are things that they're going to look at, these goals they have. And these are economic growth. It's really important because this gives you an idea how healthy the economy is. If you're increasing the amount of goods that you're producing, well, that's good. If you're not, it can be bad. Usually this causes some other issues. Not just the fact that people, aren't getting to consume as many goods and services. It also impacts unemployment. If the economy is shrinking in terms of what it's producing, well, there's going to be, a higher level of unemployment associated with that. And that's not good. People don't have a job. They can't pay their bills. They get behind on their bills. And it's just really something you want to try to avoid. So it's something they keep track of. And also another one is inflation. There's a cost associated with the high rates of inflation. You only get a raise once a year, most people. So as inflation, if it increases a lot all of a sudden, like it did about a year and a half ago, well, then a lot of people are going to fall behind. They get, their bills are going to be a lot higher than they were, and like as a result, they'll get behind from that. And there's other kind of costs associated with it as well. All right, there's different frameworks, to kind of like interpret the macroeconomy and what's going on. You could use the agri-demand, agri-supply curve. This is one way where you're looking at, you're dividing the economy up into two things. That is, the agri-demand side. This is spending side, and the agri-supply side. That's the production side. That's one way to kind of look at things. All right, and when those are in equilibrium, where the market's clearing and it's healthy. There's a Keynesian model. This is the ISLM is one of the things, and this is a model of disequilibrium. Like the economy is always like in disarray, and you need the government to step in to really keep things at full employment. All right. This is in contrast to the neoclassical model. All right. This is where the government shouldn't intervene. Like the more the government intervenes, the less efficient the market is, and that'll just hinder economic growth as a result. So the school that kind of carried on, they're called the new class schools. All right. And they're going to say, well, you're going to have these economic downturns. The government should just get out of the way. What they should do most, though, is like make sure to cut down on regulations, break up any monopolies. That's because they want things to be efficient. That is, move towards more, like the world of perfect competition, where you have companies competing with one another. If they do that, well, that'll get to the more efficient allocation, and that's good. All right. And so they're going, the new classical school, like they're kind of, again, it's like the government intervening and doing much, like with monetary and fiscal policy. But for these other two schools, Keynesians and the monetarists, like mostly you do take care of things in monetary policy. The Keynesians, like it's both of them. You use everything that you have here. And so who uses monetary policy? Well, this comes from the central bank, right? By either increasing or decreasing the money supply, or lowering the federal funds rate that they target. These are the types of tools they use to impact the economy. So if they're trying to boost the economy, well, they'll lower interest rates, like increase the money supply. They'll try to get the economy going. Fiscal policy, this comes from the government by either cutting taxes or actually direct spending. Both of these things are like trying to increase agri demand and give a boost to the economy. So here's a little run through these different schools of thought, like on interpreting macroeconomics. And this is where we're in macroeconomics. There's disagreements on things, but like not necessarily with macroeconomics. There's different schools of thought. And there's huge disagreement on things. That's because it's really hard to kind of parse out things. There's so many. There's only a certain amount of countries, and so it's really kind of hard to when you have some sort of downturn, there's so many different things that are going on at once. It's kind of hard to really parse out what's, the magnitude of each effect of these different variables, how they're changing, and what's important. And it seems like you have all these different recessions. Like sometimes a school of thought, they're the way they look at it, it comes out looking better than others. So there's kind of a constant battle between these over the years. So the Keynesian model kind of got big during the Great Depression. This is where you really call for the government stepping in and providing fiscal stimulus. Right? In the U.S. that was FDR's the make work programs, where you're paying people to do these just make work jobs. That gets them spending money and boosts the economy. This is the neoclassical, the new classes where the government should just stay out of it. The monetarists, they're kind of in between the Keynesian and the new classicals. That is, the economy, it works really well. It's better for the government to kind of stay hands off, but the government needs to make sure the monetary supply is on a good path. If you have a downturn where you're going to have an increase in the money demand, well, the central bank should meet that demand. They should increase the money supply, lower rates, all right, to help things out. All right, so one of the measurements that we talked about, the way we measure economic growth, that's looking at the real gross domestic product. All right, and so this is the U.S. from the late 40s to 2020. This is the percent change from the previous period. So these gray areas, these represent recessions. Okay, you see we had a real deep but short recession with COVID. It's because it was kind of unnatural. Like we kind of shut down parts of the economy. So you had a real bad drop, but then it shot back up, pretty quickly when restaurants and things started opening back up. All right. Now here, this is the Great Recession and the financial crisis. So this is fairly deep, but it lasted a long time. And even once the recession was over, it lasted about 2 years. Like, there for a second we was getting good growth, but then we're kind of stagnant. It took a really long time to get out of it, all right, to get the economy back to where it was. Okay, and that's because you had so many people that lost a lot of value. They had a lot of value tied up in their houses. They lost a lot of that value, and that really hurt their spending as a result of that. That's kind of why it took a while for the economy to get out of that. In the 70s, you had quite a few recessions. This one was caused by the oil embargo when OPEC formed to kind of, cut supply of oil to the U.S. As a result of that caused a negative productivity shock to the economy in the U.S. and we had a lot of periods of negative GDP growth. Yeah. All right. And what's kind of tied into this, when you see these recessions here where you got the economy actually having negative growth, where GDP is falling, you're also going to see an uptick in unemployment. These kind of go together. Right? You see at the start of the recession, unemployment here is kind of low, but at the end of it, it's all the way up around 10%. Okay, 4% at the start, 10 after it ends. The same here in 2001. Unemployment's really low, but then after the recession, it risen up a good bit. All right, so these are tied together. So this is why it's kind of really important. You want to see how the economy is growing because it has an effect on unemployment. And you want to keep this close to what's known as the natural rate. All right, this is this rate somewhere like in here, like 4 or 5%. It kind of changes depending on the country and different policies and the preferences of the people in the economy. But you want this around 4 or 5%. As you can see, it's constantly fluctuating. This represents what's known as the business cycle. You see it kind of ebbs and flows. And right now, the economy is trending back down to where it was. I think it actually is the same, or maybe 0.1% lower than it was before it started, because this doesn't go quite to the current day. All right. So how do you measure GDP? So what exactly goes into that? And so, during class, I'll kind of go over some examples to because there are some little areas where it's kind of is this part of it or is it not? Where it's kind of, to pin it down exactly. But it's the value of the output. And so these are things that are actually sold on the market. So home production, when you're cooking, that does not count. It's not sold on the market. So it's going to be the value of any output where there's a market price for it sold on the market of all the final goods. So intermediate goods aren't included in this. So if a company buys some goods and they use them to produce another good, well, they don't want to count this twice. They count it once at its final point of sale. And that's what they, adds to the GDP. All right. It could be goods and services. So not just tangible goods, but also, intangible services. This is actually the biggest part of our economy now. And they need to be produced within the country. All right. So it doesn't matter if it's a foreign company. BMW produces some cars inside our country, that goes to our GDP. So this is being produced within our borders. Okay. And in a given year. So they keep track of stuff. Usually we'll keep track of it in quarters and within years. All right. So if something's produced, it doesn't matter if it's sold or not. If it's produced within a certain year, that's when it's counted. No, this is, a good way to measure the overall size of the nation's economy and how it's performing. So you can do it by either you can break it up and measure it by how people are making purchases in the economy, who's doing it, what part of the economy is being included in based on what type of purchase it is. Or you can divide it up by looking at it, what the country produces. Okay. But here first we'll look at how the purchase is being made. Is it from consumer spending? Right? Is it being made for, a business spending or an investment? Or is it going to be government spending? Okay. And lastly, since we trade with other countries, to be able to keep track of this when you're dealing with spending, because we buy imports too, but that shouldn't count. So what you have to do is you have to subtract those out. But you also want to include goods that we export that we don't buy ourselves. This will keep track of it. And depending on whether you export more or import more, this will either lower or raise the GDP. But when you're doing it in terms of actual spending, consumer purchases, well, you got to correct for it here with the export and imports here. This is what's known as net exports. You take the exports and minus your imports. All right. Now, when it's talking about government spending here, a thing to keep in mind, it's important. Now, like you said in class, I'll kind of go in more detail about these different how these certain things that way you measure it. There's little edge cases that seem kind of hard to keep track of, but I'll go over that more. But yeah, they don't count like Social Security. That's just a transfer payment. All right. So if the government was to get this money transferred to somebody for Social Security, well, it'd be counted then. But then, when these Social Security recipients go out and spend it, it would be counted another time. So that would be essentially double spending it. And these people receiving double Social Security, they didn't provide any service or anything. They're just getting this money transferred to them. So you don't want to double count it. So any type of transfer, they're not going to count that. It's just when the government actually spends on some sort of good or service where it's going to be counted towards government spending in the GDP. Okay. Another thing when we're talking about the double counting, that is, it's the final goods and services. So it's the output used directly for consumption, for investment, or government trade purposes. Only the goods at the further stage of production. Okay. So if a bakery buys a bunch of eggs, flour, and sugar, well, they're not going to count that. They're not going to count it until they produce their cake or bread or whatever they produce, and then they sell it. And at that point, it'll be counted to the GDP. You don't want to count it when they're buying these goods because you'll double count it into the overall GDP. Give a bad measurement of how the economy is actually changing. All right, so you're not going to include these intermediate goods here. They'll be included in the GDP, in the final cost of it, in the final, sell of it. That's when they'll be included into the GDP. So there's no point in counting them twice. It'll give you an overinflated value for GDP. All right. Gross national product. This is another way to measure it. Here it's going to include also any U.S. business, like say if you're looking at the U.S. GDP. So any U.S. firms that produce overseas, it would count that as well. All right. So it's a little bit different here. So GNP is going to include any economic activity from a nation's firm that's outside of the economy as well. So it's a little bit different. Let's see here. All right, so this is breaking down these different components. As I said, when you're looking from the spending side of GDP, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So as you can see, net exports is -3. So that means we actually import more goods than we export. We actually run a trade deficit. All right. As you can see, consumption, 68%. This is the largest share of it. This is the way it is for most economies. So this is the pre-pandemic GDP here, 2019. Investment, government spending around 18-17%. So they're close to one another. As you can see, consumption is the biggest portion of the GDP. That's the most, well, they're all important, but if you see big changes in that, well, that's going to cause problems for the economy. All right, so this is looking at some of the trends in the U.S., these changes over the years. And you see consumption is kind of steady. It was around 62% in 1960. Just went up a little bit to around like 67%. Government spending, it's remained about the same. All right. You can see it's remained about 20% of the of GDP is government spending here. Investment, that's remained about the same, but you can see it's a lot more volatile than these other measurements here. Consumption is a lot more smooth, especially since about the 80s. All this has to do with consumer credit. It's a lot easier to get than it used to be. So consumption has been smoothed out more. You don't see these big fluctuations. So that's kind of helped. Maybe we had a period of time where we didn't have that many recessions for a long period of time. We only had like 2 little short ones for about say a 25 or so year period. But then here recently we've had, the COVID recession, which was really not anything fundamental issue with the economy. It was just, just a pandemic. There's nothing really you could do about it. But one of the things that we had this like long little stretch where the economy was going really well is probably just because consumption here was like smoothed out due to like credit. And so as you can see these big changes in investment, well, this is going to be a precursor, obviously like when you have a downturn. You saw this huge fall here, like going into the Great Recession in investment. And that really hurt the economy. That's one of the reasons why it went through such a long downturn, like sort of the Great Recession, where you had 2 years of where there wasn't much growth and the unemployment rate was increasing. All right, well, what about export imports? They're kind of close to the same. Then in the 70s, in the 80s, we started importing a lot more than we do exports. Now, we opened up trade with a lot more countries. China was a big part of this. So both of these went up, our imports and our exports, but imports went up at a faster rate. And that's because a lot of the companies we open up trade with, the labor's cheaper in there. And so because of that, they have an advantage. And so we get a lot of goods from these countries that have this cheaper labor. And so you see imports rose a lot faster than exports. Yeah, so it's asking, why is business investment more volatile than other components? Well, consumers, like I said, they smooth their consumption. One of the ways they do that is with credit. It's a lot easier to do. With business, like they're thinking a lot further ahead with investment. So if things are going bad, they're going to hold off on making investments. A lot of times they can trend together, and there's a lot more volatile as a result of that. All right. So remember this net export component, that is your exports minus your imports. This is going to give the value of this last measurement for GDP, looking from the spending side. And so if it's positive, you're going to have a trade surplus. That means you're producing and exporting more goods than you import. But if you're like us, you have a trade deficit. That is, you import more goods than you actually export out of the country. And here's like some different countries and the way they and so one thing to point here is Germany. They depend a lot on trade. They export a lot more than they import, but they still import a lot too. They really specialize like in certain areas, which is good for their productivity. But it kind of leaves you vulnerable. Like if you're doing that, that's the only thing when you depend so much on trade like this, when something can happen where the countries you import from, or something goes bad with the countries that you export to, the demand could decrease for it. So to me, when you depend this much on it, you are leaving yourself kind of vulnerable. For the most part, you see most of these other developed countries, China, Japan, United States, around 15 or 20% of exports and imports is what they do. China, is more export heavy, just like Germany, not quite as much as Germany, but still they export 1.2% more than they import. Japan, 17, they export as much as they import. Whereas we run a deficit here. All right. So China, Germany surplus, Japan neither. They balance each other out, and we run a deficit. You see, like almost 3%, pretty big deficit. And it has this question here: what does this statistic suggest about Germany's ability to control its own destiny? Yeah, it depends a lot on what's going on in these other countries. That's kind of precarious place to be. And it talks about how these export-oriented, but they fared a lot poorly in the post-pandemic world, where these broken supply chains can really affect things. So it's, China's been really hit. Germany's been hit as well. It's pretty bad. All right. So what about if you measure GDP? Well, how do you break it up if you're looking on the production side? Well, here's the way they break it up. They break it up into 5 main parts here. That is, to think about in terms of durable goods. These are goods that you buy, but you use them more than once. All right, you're going to use them quite often. Cars and refrigerators are good examples here. Non-durable goods. You buy food, you eat it, and that's it. Clothing, somewhat. Clothing can last a while though, if depending on blue jeans can last. Yeah, but it's still this not as long as cars or refrigerators, and some like devices in your home. Those are considered durable goods. Services. All right. Whereas instead of being something physical that you buy to use, these are like intangible, like services, like entertainment. You go to a concert, you hear the music, providing you this, this entertainment service. Healthcare. All right. You're not buying a physical good here, but providing you some sort of service here to help your physical well-being. Education, that's another intangible service. Another part of GDP, this would be structures, whether it's residents, where people like, for homes for homeowners, factories to produce goods, office buildings for firms, retail stores, stuff. So, warehouses where, firms store their goods as well. These are all like structures that will be included in the GDP from the production side. Changes in inventory. So this is any good that's produced within a year, but it hasn't been sold yet. It's going to go in inventory. Okay. So these are the 5 different ways that GDP can be broken up. All right, now what's the component of these? It's mostly services. Okay, the services comprises the bulk of GDP in the U.S. Now this is the way it is for these for countries that are more developed, like the U.S. Right? They're a service-oriented economy. All right, so look at the U.S. here. As you can see, the services went from 40 to, what is it, 62.4 now? Yeah, over 60%. Whereas non-durable goods went down. Investment stayed about the same. And durable goods went down as well. All right. Now, with these non-durable goods and durable goods, remember, this is percentage terms. It's not like the overall amount. So these are probably increased for people as well. But these services have increased more. That's because more people go to college. Right? As you get wealthier, more people go to college. Both members of a household, if you're married, are going to be working. Well, there's going to be some services they need to provide for them since they're both working now. So childcare is a big part of that. Right? You pay someone else to provide the service for you. You pay someone to do your lawn for you, so you pay. That's another service. As countries get wealthier, they see a bigger increase, and the biggest part of their economy is in the service sector. All right. Okay. Now, there's 2 different types of GDP, nominal and real. Nominal is when we just look at the actual dollar amount, if you're looking at the US here. So nominal here is in blue. And they have a base year. They use this year's price for everything. And as you can see, since we've had inflation, well, nominal GDPs rose higher than real GDP. But that's not that's it's useful, it's a useful variable to keep track of, nominal GDP, but you really, at the end of the day, you want to know, like, well, how much of the actual goods and services being produced increased or decreased. That can give you like the really the right value to determine whether the economy is performing well or not. Okay, so if you don't correct for inflation, it can give you like a bad reading on things. So here's an example kind of illustrating that. So from 2007 to 2009, there's actually an increase in overall nominal GDP. So obviously the economy's not doing well, but it's showing that at least it didn't shrink. But when you correct for inflation here, okay, and you use what's known as the GDP deflator, that's using the change in the prices of the goods that's being produced each year. Inflation was 2.6 per year over this time period. So prices were 2.6% higher for the goods that were produced within the US. And so once you correct for this, well, the real GDP shows that there was actually a fall, instead of actually a small increase. So in real terms, GDP went from 15.6 trillion to about 15.2 trillion. So that shows you how severe it was this period here. So you had a huge drop in yearly GDP from 2007 to 2009. Okay, and so that's why it's important to correct for inflation here. At the end of the day, inflation is something you'll keep track of too, but like nominal GDP is kind of important like that for the central bank. It's something they keep track of. It's important for them, but like you want to see the actual goods and services, how many of them are actually being produced each year. And that'll give you a better measurement of how the economy is performing. Okay, so this is the government keeps track of this growth rate of GDP. It does it for each quarter, so there's 4 quarters in a year. And how they define a recession. Well, there's 2 different ways. One, the simple kind of way is like when there's a drop there's 2 consecutive drops in GDP growth, like you have negative growth 2 periods in a row. But the other way, it looks a little bit more other variables besides that. It's done by the National Bureau of Economic Research. And that's when there's a significant decline in economic activity that spans over, at least a few months. It has to be more than just like a month or 2. And there's 3 criteria they look at: the depth, it needs to be fairly severe; diffusion, it doesn't need just to be one part of the economy. That's not what defines recession. It needs to be like a good bit of the economy's, being hit by it. And duration, it needs to be like over an extended period of time. Depression, there's not like a standard definition. When we say, I think maybe the benchmark is like, well, the Great Depression in the 30s. It lasted like, 10 years or so. Yeah. And so if we had something that lasted like, 6, 8, 10 years, I would consider that another depression. It's, it gets kind of a little bit more, well, when we had the 2-year period after the financial crisis, we called it the Great Recession. We still call it a recession. And so the National Bureau, they try to keep track of it in terms of like monthly, like from a starting month to an end of month. Whereas if you use the other definition where it's like 2 consecutive periods of GDP growth, then it's like it ranges over like just different quarters. And that's what these gray areas are here. These are the time periods where we had a recession measured by the NBER, these different things they look at, unemployment and the GDP growth. So we had this fairly long one from the financial crisis, really short, but it was deep, but it was really short, the COVID recession. And here's, it doesn't show it here, but like we've had at the first 2 quarters in 2022 from last year, we actually had, or was it second and third quarter? We had 2 quarters in a row were negative growth. But like, so by one definition, it was a recession, but they didn't really call that because with the NBER, since there wasn't an increase in unemployment, they didn't consider it a recession from that standpoint. Most of the time, these things always agree. Like 95% of the time, they'll agree. The only other time they didn't agree, in 2001 and 2, there wasn't consecutive drops in GDP, but we did have one. Like you had the economy was kind of recovering, but like unemployment was increasing. So you had this what we call the jobless recovery, and so this this is where you had this kind of disagreement between these 2 definitions of recession here. All right, now converting it. When you're comparing different countries that use a different currency. So in 2013, Brazil's GDP was 4.8 trillion reals. That's their currency they use. The US's GDP was $16.6 trillion. Well, we want to see, in terms of US dollars, what was Brazil's GDP? Right? And so the exchange rate at this point was 2.157 reals for a dollar. So the real was weaker in comparison to the dollar. In order to get $1, you needed 2.157 reals. All right, so let's convert this and see what would happen. How do you convert it to get Brazil's GDP in US dollars? Well, you take Brazil's GDP in reals and you divide by the exchange rate. That is 2.157 reals for every dollar. Right? And so when you do that, you take the 4.845 trillion reals and the fact that it's weaker than the dollar by, it takes a little more than two for each dollar. That basically cuts it in half. So it's even smaller than what it looked at. So it's, instead of being a quarter the size of the US economy, it's about an eighth of the size of the US economy. Okay. Now, the only issue with this using exchange rate, remember we talked about this is very volatile in the short run. These can fluctuate really, a good amount depending on, how capital flows are going and any sort of change in the trade between different countries can affect it as well. So another way you can do it is by looking at purchasing power parity. That is, you look at this basket of common goods between these countries and you compare the prices of them. And then you use that to adjust for it. Kind of a popular one that was popularized by the Economist magazine. It's known as the Big Mac Index. Since McDonald's has restaurants and just about every developed country, well, you compare the price of what does a Big Mac cost in that country, and you use that to correct for the GDP, and that give you a better idea of what's going on. All right, so let's kind of look at some of these big countries here and see how their GDP has changed over the year. Now, instead of just looking at GDP in total, I kind of want you to look at too, you want to see, at the end of the day, you want to see the purchasing power, the standard of living that an individual person has. So one way you can do that is to get it on a per person basis, just take the total GDP in the country and just divide by the population, right? And that'll give you GDP per capita. Now let's look at some of these. In China, from 1990, it was $729 per person per capita. But then in about 2019, it was all the way up to 8,000. That's a huge increase. The type of growth they experience is pretty crazy. It's kind of similar to the way the U.S., the kind of growth they had in the early 1900s and last century. The century before that, in the 1800s, Great Britain was the country that had the explosion in growth. Whereas China, this century so far, is a country that's showing this huge amount of growth so far. All right, Japan, you see its GDP per capita went from 38,000 to around 49,000. Germany, 32 to 47, so a 46% increase. In the US, pretty well, from 36 per person. They were actually behind Japan for a while, but now they're at 55,000 per person. Now, one thing with Japan, their population is really old, so a bigger portion of their population is not working, so it's kind of hurt their GDP per capita. And also too, this kind of shows, this doesn't show how issue of equality, how this money is distributed. So in China, it's these coastal cities where they have these special economic zones, so they're going to be really wealthy versus some of these more rural areas are going to still be kind of still experience a lot of poverty, right? A lot better than they were after this growth, but they haven't, this didn't go equally between each people. You're going to see more growth, a higher standard of living in these coastal cities in China versus the more rural areas. Okay. Lastly, this is a point they always want to make with GDP. It doesn't, measure every type of things associated with your standard of living. It's just one way to look at it. Okay. So on one hand, it doesn't even measure just everything on a consumption level that you actually pay, that you would pay for, or like potentially pay for to consume. Like, so, a more developed country with both members of the household working, well, you're not going to fix your food most of the time. You're going to go out to eat more often, have someone else prepare it, right? And so that's going to, anytime you do that, it's going to be, shown in the GDP, like when you go out to a restaurant or whatever. Versus some of these poor countries or middle income countries, they're going to be more likely to fix their own food. So the GDP is not going to capture that, right? So that's one way it's not always accurate when you're comparing between countries. Another thing too is GDP is not going to, it's not a perfect indicator for like, what's going on in the environment or, the level of medical care, like your health of people. Education of a country, the level of inequality, it doesn't take any time for that. Leisure time that you have, what type of economic opportunity you have, and a lot of these other variables. But one thing, and these things sort of trend though, they do trend with like, as you get these higher levels of GDP per person, usually the wealthier countries, they're able to do stuff to clean up their environment. And so they actually like have a lot cleaner air for the most part. They're going to be healthier because they have more money to spend on healthcare. Education levels are going to be usually be higher because the country is wealthier. The parents can afford to let their kids stay in college longer, devote more money towards education. Because when you're in the developed country, like you're going to need more specialization. That means people need to be trained more. They need to have a higher level of education. And so since the economy needs this, well, it's going to, the government's going to step in and ensure that this takes place. Like you're going to see a higher level of education. GDP doesn't capture this directly, but like, as you're wealthier, well, you can spend more on stuff like this. You can make sure the education level is at a higher level, spending it. All right. And with leisure, well, a lot of times, you spend money on stuff during your leisure time. And so the higher GDP, well, that can help you enjoy leisure a little bit more sometimes. Now, some things aren't like, going for a hike in the woods. That has nothing to do with it. But, what if you're going to have a picnic somewhere, go hiking and go to a picnic? Well, the more wealthy you are as a country, the more you can spend on like, what sort of things you have, like on your picnic. Let's see. All right, so that's it for this first video. And so this first chapter and all this took a little bit longer. So I'll make another video for chapter 20 and 21. All right, I hope this was helpful.